This is London, a city with 215,700 millionaires, 352 centimillionaires, and 33 billionaires. That makes London the sixth wealthiest city in the world. If London were a country, it would have an economy bigger than Sweden, Argentina, or the UAE. As a global financial hub, London leads in banking, insurance, legal services, and capital markets. London accounts for about 22% of the UK's total economic output. Without it, UK's GDP would drop by 14%. London's wealth stands out against the rest of the UK. Many northern regions have disposable incomes lower than Portugal or even the poorest US states and OECD averages. In London, 25 to 27% of homes are bought by foreign buyers. That is much higher than 0.3% in New York or 5% in Toronto. Beyond London's shine, the UK faces big challenges. GDP growth is slow at just 1.3%. The economy grew only 0.3% in the second quarter of 2025. Inflation is stuck at 3.6%, which is almost double of government target. Unemployment is expected to rise to 4.5% by year-end. Even UK is the only G7 country that is still struggling in wages, which has been stagnant since 2008 recession. Rents are skyrocketed. Productivity growth is just 0.4%, and the average cost of living is risen by over 25% within the small window of 3 years. This slow stall has shrunk the middle class from 65% in 1990 to just 36% today. Today, the country owes £2.9 trillion in debt, which is almost 100% of what it produces in a year. Every month, this amount grows by £17 billion. It means every person in the UK owes about £41,000 in government debt. Interest rates are now at unseen levels and cost more than £100 billion a year, consistently more than the entire defense budget and nearly as much as education. The money which should be used for better education, health, and infrastructure, instead using up for interest payment and shifted to creditors. And borrowing costs did not just hurt government, they push up mortgages, raise prices, break investors' trust, and weaken the pound. Once, UK government bonds were a symbol of trust worldwide. Countries bought them because Britain always paid back. This trust fueled dreams of progress, letting the government borrow cheaply for railways, schools, and hospitals. But now, rising prices and higher interest rates make debt very expensive. Across much of the UK, hardship grows. This is the real story of Britain today, a nation of wealth and global influence, but struggling with debt, stagnant growth, and growing inequality. But how did it get here? It all started in the 1970s. Government spent more than it earned. The economy grew slowly, yet prices rose fast. £100 in 1970 was worth £300 by 1979, 3 times, because of high inflation. In 1973, OPEC countries raised oil prices 4 times. This happened after Western countries supported Israel. Britain imported 95% of its oil, so it was hit hard. Inflation reached to double-digit. Economy looked riskier. Interest rates climbed to 15%. By 1976, economy became so weak it needed a £2.9 billion bailout from the IMF. It was the biggest loan ever in their history. In 1979, PM Margaret Thatcher, in order to stop inflation, slow down credit, and make borrowing expensive, first cut the money supply from 12% to 6% by 1984. They raised interest rates from 12% to 14%, then to 17%, the highest ever. They also cut government borrowing from 4.7% to 1.5% of the economy. They even raised taxes during a difficult time. The condition was painful, but the country never defaulted. In 1986, the Big Bang deregulation package opened London's finance sector. It created 1,500 millionaires and brought in £450 million in the city, and London was called as the world's dominant financial sector. GDP reached from 1.08 trillion Great Britain pound to 1.4 trillion Great Britain pound by 1990. Britain became affluent. As a result, inflation fell to 5% by 1983, but many factories and sectors closed and exports become uncompetitive. Manufacturing dropped from 30% to 16% of the economy by 1990. Over 2 million people lost their jobs. At the worst point, 100,000 jobs disappeared every month. Thatcher's policies tamed inflation, but it also made inequality worse. The Gini coefficient went from 25 to 35. That means GDP per capita grows by 30% while inequality by 40%.
Then came 2008 financial crisis started in the US but hit Britain hard. Various banks collapsed, credit freeze and unemployment exploded. The government borrowed £137 billion to keep the economy alive. GDP fell by more than 6% in that year, which took 5 years to recover. Successive governments also made deep cuts in expenditures to stabilize debt. Since 2008, the economy barely grown, yet government spending has kept increasing. Every time borrowing gets more expensive, less the money for the services people actually use. Debt jumped from 41% to 83% of the by 2015. Industries like fishing and manufacturing never recovered. Productivity hit the record low. Hiring was stopped. Investment dried, everything became uncertain. Brexit in 2016 introduced trade barriers and foreign investment fell by more than 30%, which added £500 billion in debt. Then, in 2020, GDP shrunk by 10% in a single year. Government borrowed £376 billion for furlough programs, emergency aid and bailouts. Bank of England had to lower interest rate to just 0.1%. Soon debt reached £2.5 trillion by 2023. That was £620 billion more in just 3 years. From outside, everything seems manageable. Interest rates were cheap. Underneath, with so much of new money in the economy, inflation became inevitable. The Bank of England had no choice and had to increase interest rates again. As a result, debt wasn't cheap anymore. 1/4 of the debt is linked to inflation. When prices rose, costs went up fast. Borrowing costs are near at 3 decades high. Pension funds sold 40% of their UK bonds since 2021. They no longer trust them as much. Foreign investors own 30 to 35% of the bonds. They want higher returns. This pushes up costs for everyone. That means less tax money for the government. In 2022, Prime Minister Liz Truss announced a mini-budget. It included £45 billion in tax cuts, but no plan to cut spending. Investors panicked. They sold UK bonds. The pound fell to $1.035, its lowest ever. Pension funds nearly collapsed. The Bank of England spent £65 billion to save the system. The Office for Budget Responsibility says debt could reach 270% of the economy by the 2070s. Recently, economists warned the UK could face a 1976-style IMF bailout. High debt and borrowing costs have sparked these fears. The IMF's 2025 review calls Britain's fiscal space very limited. Without cuts or tax hikes, a bailout could be needed. Britain imports 40% of its food and energy. A weaker pound makes everything more expensive. Raising interest rates to fight inflation makes borrowing even costlier. It is a trap. There is less tax money. And the Institute for Fiscal Studies warns of a £50 billion budget gap every year. However, debt is not the only problem. Britain's economy is stuck. Productivity means how much workers produce in an hour. It used to grow 2% a year before 2008, not high but modest and consistent. After 2008, it's almost flat-tenned. In 2024, it grew only 0.4%. Today, in terms of productivity levels, Britain ranks in bottom 10% of all OECD countries. The main reason of this downfall was chronic underinvestment. Since 2005, British companies have invested 20% less than its counterparts Germany, US, or France. Even basic business investment slowed. Manufacturing and transport sectors get less money for new machines. UK workers have far less equipment than workers in Germany or Japan. Britain has great universities and strong industries like biotech and finance. But there is not enough money for new ideas. While other countries emerged from 2008 crisis by reinvesting into productivity. Germany trained more workers, doubled down apprenticeship, and export world-class infrastructure. The US built tech centers, research clusters, and fintech. France updated its factories and modernized its industrial base. But Britain goes the other way. Britain cut training programs, froze government wages, and relied on cheap labor to fill productivity gap. Today, productivity has turned itself into a national emergency. No productivity growth means no wage growth, means no social mobility, and the generation is trapped. Brexit made things worse. Since leaving the EU in 2020, foreign companies invested 25% less. Many moved to Dublin or Amsterdam. Trade with the EU, Britain's biggest market, is 15% lower. That is worse than Canada's stable trade with the US or Germany's trade with the EU. People have 20% less spending money than the European average. That gap was only 8% in 2007. In 1979, manufacturing made up nearly 30% of UK's GDP. By 1990, it had dropped to 16%. Manufacturing employment also collapsed, falling by almost 40% between 1979 and 1993. So even though overall GDP and GDP per capita rose, the transition wasn't smooth for much of the country. As the UK shifted toward a service-led economy, some industries grew while many others declined. A useful way to see the impact is by looking at how many indirect jobs each industry creates. If a factory hires 100 workers, it might generate another 300 indirect jobs across suppliers, distributors, and supporting services, a 1-to-3 ratio. Banking has a 1-to-2 ratio. Iron manufacturing is far more job-intensive, is having a 1-to-9 ratio. Even the broader financial services sector has about 1 minute and 3.6 seconds, which sounds strong but still trails utilities and both durable and non-durable manufacturing. This helps explain why service sector growth boosts GDP but often widens inequality. Shift away from manufacturing contributed directly to rising inequality. This inequality makes it harder for the government to build unity and trust. The housing crisis shows how bad things are. Nearly 300,000 families and individuals now experiencing the worst forms of homelessness. 172,420 children are now in temporary accommodation. An 8% increase in a year and the highest number since records began. The UK has the highest homelessness rate in the rich world. England builds 200,000 homes a year, but it needs 300,000. This has created a shortage of 4.3 million homes. The right to buy scheme started in 1980. It let council tenants buy their homes at a discount. It sold 1.5 million public homes. In London, the number of council homes fell from 715,000 to 390,000, a 61% drop. Only 162,000 public homes are left. But 1.2 million people are on the waiting list. Private rents in London average £2,694 a month in 2024. Rents rose 25% in cities like Manchester and Bristol since 2021. The average home costs £273,000. That is more than 7 times the average salary of £37,600. In London, homes cost £523,000. That is 12 times the average income. Home ownership between the age group of 25 to 34 has slipped from 59% in 2000 to 28% as of now. Many are stuck renting and barely surviving. Even the National Health Service, which used to be Britain's pride, now it is in trouble. 1 in 9 people is waiting for hospital treatment. That is 7.41 million people as of now, which was 3 million in 2014. By 2040, 25% of people will be over 65. They will need expensive care. Medical costs rise twice as fast as normal prices. Over 2,000 hospital buildings older than the NHS. There are leaking roofs, broken machines, and old designs. In 2023, there were 4,500 serious building problems. Crumbling hospitals cause over 100 care disruptions a week. Fixing them needs £14 billion. Cost almost tripled in a decade. Other public services are struggling too. UK consistently spends less on infrastructure compared to the average for high-income countries, other G7 and OECD countries. Public services are just holding on. They are not getting better. Britain's workforce is getting smaller. Unemployment rate touches 5%. The economy loses £25 billion every year because of high unemployment. 21% of people are economically inactive. That means they are not working and not looking for work. In total, 9.08 million people fall into this group, out of which 2.8 million working-age adults cannot work because of long-term illness. It puts huge pressure on the NHS and welfare system. Rising unemployment could send Britain back to the 80s. Net migration fell to 431,000 in 2024. That is down 50% from 2023. But migration is still a big political issue. Immigration has helped fill job gaps. But new rules in October 2025 make it harder. The government raised the immigration skills charge by 32%. That is the fee employers pay to sponsor workers, in order to reduce migration and boost local training. But they could hurt businesses that need skilled workers. By 2040, 25% of the population will be over 65. The country will need much more money for pensions and healthcare. But fewer working people will pay taxes. The last time Britain spent less than it earned was in 2000-2001. Last year, the deficit was £152 billion. Revenue cannot keep up with growing demands. Immigration debates add tension. They divide people and make policy hard. This gives birth to more inequality. Workers from abroad often take low-pay jobs. That keeps wages low for locals. It also strains services like housing and schools. Without balance, immigration can widen the gap between rich and poor. 1 in 5 people earning £40,000 to £70,000 faces financial stress. 2/3 of them worry about money every day. Life satisfaction, which is measured on a scale of 0 to 10. In the 2024, the UK scored 6.75, ranks 23rd. 37% of people say they are rarely or never happy. 1 in 6 adults has depression. That rate is stable in 2025 but nearly double what it was in 2010. This is not just about money. It is about losing hope and pride in Britain's future. Inequality makes these problems worse. That means the rich get much richer. The poor stay stuck. This gap breeds resentment. UK ranks 9th most unequal income country in the OECD, where top 5th controls 36% of nation's income on country bottom 5th has to struggle within 9%. It slows social mobility. People feel the system is rigged. This leads to more crime and less trust in leaders. When many people cannot spend, growth slows. It is a cycle that feeds on itself. Breaking it needs bold changes. But politics makes it hard. The real challenge is about bringing back trust, opportunity, and belief in a better future. Can Britain's leaders find the courage to act? Or are we watching the slow fall of a once great nation?